Sesko, very talented player. You mentioned Chelsea looking at that younger model, are serious about him. You've mentioned Arsenal in that conversation. You read multiple reports every day. John Cross, I think, stated that the player has agreed to the Arsenal move. I interpreted that as he's probably said, yes, that looks like a good offer, as opposed to exclusively picking Arsenal. Who do you see at the moment leading that race, and how advanced is Benjamin Sesko's potential transfer, whether it to be to Arsenal or whether it be to Chelsea, considering this deadline before the Euros that we've read? So where are Arsenal in this conversation, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I think John Cross is a fantastic journalist and also does great work for us at the Football Writers Association, including putting on the awards a couple of weeks ago that Phil Foden and Bunny Shaw won. So huge respect for John. And I think he's absolutely right in what he says regarding Arsenal's firm interest. My understanding is that Arsenal and Chelsea are the two clubs pushing, and nobody's saying that Sesko won't end up at Arsenal. It's just, as a journalist, we don't bet based on the odds as of now. We wait and see how things transpire. And I'm still told it's open. I'm told that Arsenal are serious on Sesko, but they have a couple of other names on their list too. Evan Ferguson, Joshua Zirkzee, who's still widely expected to go to Milan, and Victor Gyökeres, who Chelsea at the moment have ruled out. And I think Gyökeres is going to be tough for Arsenal if they don't proceed with Sesko, because the cost is a lot higher. And again, he demands bigger wages than Sesko. So I would say at the moment it's Arsenal and Chelsea that are the two front runners. And I don't think that Sesko has yet said yes definitively to any one club. Otherwise, the deal would have been done. And the reason why I say that is not because of Chelsea or any other interest. It's out of respect to Leipzig, because Leipzig have got a renewal on the table. And they're doing all they can to say to Sesko, look, you can go where you want in a year's time, but stay for 1 year and we'll pay you Premier League wages in the next 12 months. And at the moment, Leipzig sources insist that Sesko has not given them an answer. So if it's not given them an answer, then it would be unlikely that he's been so disrespectful to give Arsenal an answer first. But I expect Arsenal to push. I think they had 7 names on their list, and it's now down to just 2 or 3. And I believe that Sesko is right up there with the top target for Arsenal. And I think he's one of the top 2 for Chelsea as well. So it's a bit like, and I'm not saying it's going to end like this. I'm not predicting anything because we don't bet as journalists. We report what we know. The window's not open. So it's normal that things being said now might be a bit premature because there can always be a twist and the window isn't open. But it reminds me a little bit, and I say this very loosely and very cautiously, and it will get taken out of context on social media, but it reminds me of Mudryk in the sense that Arsenal were favourites, the player wanted Arsenal, Arsenal were pushing, Arsenal felt confident. But in that case, and I'm not saying it will happen with Sesko, Mudryk ended up joining Chelsea with a hijack. And I use that as an example to tell you, as long as it's open, you can have these twists and turns. But it is definitely true to say that Arsenal are one of the front runners. And in my personal opinion, taking the reporting away, it wouldn't surprise me if Sesko ended up at Arsenal, but it also wouldn't surprise me if Chelsea try and ruffle a few feathers.
Look, I understand that. I think it's one of those things where Arsenal fans won't like hearing that, but it's the nature of the situation. I've said it about the Elise situation with many. I've heard reports that he maybe prefers us. You said the same thing, but that for me, I'm not counting my chickens with that, because Chelsea do Chelsea things in this transfer window. We've seen them. Even in these horrible times they're going through, we've seen them beat top teams to players. And I think there's something in that. It's certainly going to be an interesting one. We've also touched on Osimhen when it comes to Chelsea. Damasio is continually reporting that Arsenal are there. Arsenal are interested. They're not near the release clause yet, but Arsenal have an interest, and Arsenal are genuinely in for him. Have you heard anything like that coming out of the Arsenal camp as opposed to the Italian side?
Sorry, you dropped out, Terry. Who was that?
So Damasio is sort of consistently reported about Arsenal having a firm interest in Osimhen. What's your understanding of that?
Yeah, the cost of Osimhen has always been said by Arsenal sources to be prohibitive. So it will be surprising. And again, if they got Sesko, then that would be that, you would presume, and they will want to consider the future of Eddie Nketiah, who is still liked by both Crystal Palace and Wolves. And Fulham might even be in the market now for a striker because it didn't work out with Amanda Broja, but Rodrigo Muniz obviously did excellent when Broja joined. They would still like to add some goals. So I don't see Arsenal signing 2 flagship forwards. I do see them getting rid of Nketiah at the right number. So logically, if they get Sesko, like the chat seems to think they will, then that would mean that they would put their investment elsewhere, into midfield, into potentially a young defender. But it won't be Sesko and Osimhen. It's not going to be that kind of window. And I'm not aware of anything at this point direct between Arsenal and Napoli. You always have intermediaries, you always have whispers, you always sound out the deal. But Arsenal have to think about finances. And they don't want to, for example, trigger the Bruno Guimaraes clause because it's too expensive. And they also first need to see what kind of midfielder they want. Because even though Rice is very flexible, if Rice is defined on paper as a number 8, they'll move for a number 6. If Rice is defined as a number 6, they'll move for a number 8. There's a lot of moving parts. But if Arsenal are not going to trigger a release clause for Bruno Guimaraes and instead go a little bit cheaper potentially for a player like Martin Zubimendi, who loves it at Sociedad, but if they can persuade him to leave, then that's more cost effective, fee-wise, agent fee-wise, wage-wise, and there is a release clause there. So if they're not going to think about Guimaraes' release clause, then it would be very strange strategically to say, but we're going to pay over 100 million for Victor Osimhen, 250k a week and the agent fees. So again, I don't like to shout down others' reporting because I know all of these colleagues work very hard and source all of their work very well. And we all try and go to all sides. So if Damasio thinks Arsenal, then I respect that. And I would never shut the door or categorically shout down a colleague. But I'm not aware of anything direct at the moment between Arsenal and Osimhen. I'm not saying that can't change, but I think that Sesko has concrete contact. And were Osimhen and Arsenal to happen, then it would have to develop and advance comparative to where I'm told it is now.
That makes perfect sense to me. You mentioned the midfield there. You mentioned Bruno Guimaraes. Obviously, another Newcastle player linked to Arsenal is Alexander Isak. I have been, every single time we've spoken about these transfers on our shows, Newcastle fans in my DMs, in the comments section going crazy. We are not selling either of them. Neither are going to leave. Do you think it's that clear cut from a Newcastle perspective when it comes to Arsenal or other clubs' pursuits? Because City are linked to Bruno Guimaraes as well. Is it likely one of those two leaves Newcastle? And if so, where do you see them ending up based on the noises coming out right now?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see Alexander Isak leave. And if that was possible, Arsenal would very much be in the conversation because they had a historical interest in him. But that will be a near automatic rejection. And even though teams may want to play upon Newcastle's financial situation, I think he's the last player that Newcastle will consider losing. And if they have to find this 30 to 50 million minimum to satisfy profit and sustainability, they'll do that through 3 or 4 small sales rather than sacrifice Isak. With Bruno Guimaraes, it's a bit different because there is a release clause there. So it's out of Newcastle's control if somebody chooses to trigger it. And with the whole Lucas Paqueta gambling breaches and the knock-on effect of that being that Manchester City are not expected to move, we still have to wait and see what kind of punishment he gets and what his future is at West Ham because of that. But that, coupled with the release clause, means that Manchester City still have a realistic possibility of trying something, whether triggering the release clause or offering something in and around it. So we can't rule out a Bruno exit. And Newcastle will say what you expect them to say on record, which is essentially that they don't want to lose either. And people hear their manager say that and think, great, well, that's that. And I don't blame Newcastle fans for taking that position. But what else is the manager supposed to say? But the reality is that if Newcastle were to lose Guimaraes, because hypothetically the clause was triggered and the player wanted to move and it was taken out of their hands, then it wouldn't be as big a disaster comparative to Isak. Because it's only a 3-man midfield in a 4-3-3. They got Sandro Tonali coming back from the ban. They got Joe Linton who can play in midfield. They would have some funds to buy another midfielder. And in addition to that, you got players like Sean Longstaff, Elliot Anderson, Lewis Miley. There's plenty in that midfield. Whereas you lose Isak and Callum Wilson is maybe only got another season at Newcastle. He could even depart this summer as well. And you're thin. And you either have to move Anthony Gordon central. I think he would relish that role, but he might not get the 20-plus goals that Alexander Isak got last season. So Isak's a bigger blow comparative to Guimaraes. They're both huge blows for Newcastle. And we should point out, Bruno's not forcing his way out of the club. He likes it at Newcastle United. But let's just wait and see, because there is still a possibility that Manchester United move. Arsenal are only going to move if the price drops significantly. They're not going to trigger the clause, according to my information. And PSG are not negotiating for Guimaraes, even though we keep hearing links at this stage. So it's looking like Manchester City or nothing. I was told that Al Hilal might make an audacious effort as well to trigger the clause, but I don't think that Bruno Guimaraes wants to go there. And then just because we're kind of vaguely on Man City, Kevin De Bruyne, very interesting one. Keep an eye on Saudi Arabia. I've reported this time and time again over the last 6 or 7 months. Of course, Man City want him to stay, but don't be surprised this summer, not next summer, if Saudi Arabia try, because they've already been pushing on the De Bruyne side. They'll be patient if they need to, like Mo Salah, and wait until 2025, but don't be at all shocked if something concrete, whether he stays or goes, something concrete lands on Manchester City's doorstep regarding Kevin De Bruyne and Saudi Arabia.
That's certainly going to be an interesting one, because it does feel that he's coming to the end of his time in England. Such a potent player, dangerous player. I'll be very glad to see the back of him, to be honest. as a Man United fan, absolutely. Yeah, the Bruno Guimaraes one is very, very interesting indeed. This we've already had this question. It says, Ben, how likely is Bruno G to City in your opinion? What percentage would you put on it as of now? Not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot.
Yeah, it's not that we don't answer these questions as journalists, and I know it appears that we sort of sit on the fence at times. It's just that if you want a percentage, then go to a bookie and get yourself odds. But percentage-wise, it can change every single day. So you have to back up your reporting based on sources that you trust and sources you put scrutiny on. So I'm not going to put a percentage on it, other than say, if Manchester City trigger the Bruno clause, I would be relatively certain that Bruno would say, great, I'm going to join Man City. I would be shocked if there was a scenario where the clause was triggered, it was out of Newcastle's control. I'd be shocked if Bruno then said, no, I want to reject that and stay at Newcastle United. But in terms of how likely is it that they're going to trigger the clause? Well, I think it's more likely they would come in around the clause and use the clause as a yardstick. And I also think there's a likelihood, even though maybe Newcastle fans think once the clause expires, because remember, the last week in June, it's gone. And I think Newcastle fans feel like this is about nervously waiting between now and when the clause expires. And then if nobody's triggered the clause saying he's a Newcastle player, I'm not so sure. I think that clubs will wait until the clause expires or around the time it's expiring, and then put pressure on Newcastle's financial situation with an offer more like 80, 85 million below the clause, and see whether Newcastle are forced to sell because of their financial situation. So I don't think this will necessarily be clause or nothing, although naturally you would expect Newcastle to start with that position now, because they're in a position of strength due to the fact that the window's not even open and the clause exists. And that's what I mean about not trying to place odds on it as a journalist or put a percentage on it, because fine, you go away with a number and you think, I've got a nice, tidy little conclusion to my super chat. Ben Jacobs says it's 85% likely that Bruno Guimaraes will go to Manchester City. But then you'll only find you come back to me in a week or 2 weeks and then say, well, why is it only 50% now? Why is it only 5% now? And in the end, I'm not doing a service to you as a journalist by being responsible. I'm giving you a number plucked out of thin air based on a bunch of variables. So right now, Newcastle will be pushing this line. We're in a strong position because the window's not open and the clause exists. So it's clause or nothing. But wait until, if they don't bring in any money and it gets to a week before the clause expires, are they still saying clause or nothing? And then wait until after the clause expires and you've got this 30th of June deadline and PSR. And again, if Newcastle haven't brought in any money, wait and see whether then their position is still Bruno Guimaraes is not for sale. And there's those variables. And as journalists, we're the messengers. So we understand the market. We understand the possibilities. We try and report credibly and with context those possibilities. But anyone telling you right now, there's an X% chance it's going to happen, is effectively gambling on what the different scenarios that may pan out may be. And if you want to gamble, then go with what the bookies say the percentage is, put down a tenner and see how much money you make come the end of the summer.
There we go.